Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started with today's presentation on our growth series webinar on the topic of best customers, best results, unlocking retention-driven B2C growth. And I'm super excited to have our guest presenter today, who I will introduce in a second. If there's something that you're dying to learn or pain point you're trying to solve for that perhaps we can cover today, go ahead and type that in. And also, obviously, chime in with questions throughout the entirety of the presentation. We may get to it during the course of the presentation, but if we don't, we'll certainly try to address it at the end when we have dedicated Q&A time. All right, if I haven't had a chance to meet any of you yet, because we do have portfolio companies as well as we made this webinar open to the general public. My name is Tony Yang. I'm the head of growth here at Mucker, which just basically means I have the privilege of working with a lot of very smart founders, providing advice on how to scale their growth and go-to-market strategies. But really, the star of today's show is our friend Julius Lai. Julius is in an interesting spot than most of our speakers that we've had in the recent months, because Julius is also a current Mucker portfolio company founder. This is something that we really want to do more of. So if you are a Mucker founder and are willing to share your expertise like Julius, please definitely reach out to me or Britton afterwards, because we want to foster a community where we learn from each other. But Julius, we're super excited to have him. He has a tremendous track record. One of the reasons why we asked him to speak on this topic is because he's done this for very large and well-known brands such as AMC Theaters. He ran loyalty marketing there at Expedia, Ritz-Carlton, Marriott. He was the CMO at H&R Block. So super excited to learn from you, Julius. Go ahead and take away. I'll try to chime in here and there just to keep the conversation going, but we're super excited to learn from you today.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I appreciate the kind introduction, and it is my pleasure to have an opportunity to share today. I believe in being helpful, and to the extent that I can be helpful, sharing some experience from my background to founders, then it's certainly my pleasure. And I have no doubt that if I ask for help from the community as a first-time startup founder myself, that that will be returned as well. Life is better as a team sport, and we're all here to help each other. I'm happy to. What my intent today is to walk through my pitch for why retention is an area of focus that is, generally speaking, underserved at many companies, and especially at many startups, when you're so focused on getting traction, getting acquisition, getting growth, and doing those different types of things. I'd also like everyone to walk away with a really simple diagnostic that they can use and execute in less than 60 minutes to say, hey, where am I in my maturity of understanding customers, how much I know about them, and if I'm decently along, how can I use that as a future roadmap? And then finally, it'll be my pleasure to share some examples from brands that across my experience, which may be relevant to the markets that you're in, or that you'll be able to kind of draw similar lessons from as well. I know that we've got at least one attendee here that is focused on loyalty programs. That is an area of deep expertise for me, and I won't get into that in super deep detail in this particular webinar, because that tends to be a mature stage product for most companies that are out there. But I'm happy to kind of discuss that offline, and my contact information will be at the end. So, hey, not all of us are B2C, but why are we even here talking about retention? And the simple answer is, we're all here to grow ARR, right? It matters a lot, and it's probably uncontroversial that ARR is really important. And it's probably uncontroversial that getting something to happen many times is a lot harder than getting it to happen once. However, let me posit a couple of controversial statements as thought starters and to kind of prime the pump for the rest of today's webinar, which is that assuming you have some amount of initial traction, I would posit that retention becomes much, much more important than acquisition if you're interested in growing ARR over a long period of time. And we'll walk through a little bit of math on the next slide to kind of unpack that a little bit. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it's always helpful to see that. Second of all is that there's lots of things that are out there for growth hacking for acquisition. It feels like something that's known, the tactics are known, and all those different types of things. But for many people, retention seems like a mystery, right? Like, hey, I can't control what customers do. They're going to come, they're going to leave, and whatever else. I would posit that it is not a mystery. It is, in fact, a puzzle. In fact, it should be easier to retain your customers because you know more about them. They've already hand raised so much, and you have so much more data than it is to go and acquire a new customer. I will talk through some examples of why I believe that this is the case and why retention is important and it's possible, right? That's a very important combination. Another perhaps uncontroversial statement is you should not pay attention to 100% of your customers. In fact, you may actually make better decisions by focusing on the top 20% of your customer base and air quote, ignoring the bottom 80% of your customers. Of course, I don't literally mean ignore, and we'll walk through this as we go over the course of the webinar, but I'm making these statements up front just to kind of prime the pump and kind of set the stage for things that we'll talk about over the course of the next few minutes. All right, I promised there would be some math. I promised there will be not a lot of math, and this is purely directional just to illustrate a point. But the reason why retention has such an impact over ARR is because it is both a bottom of the funnel KPI and it is a multi-year KPI. And that's basically some of the core drivers when you do your ARR calculation. So the way that I would encourage us to think about it, it's that you can add fuel by growing acquisition to your startup rocket ship. But if you have an opportunity to reverse gravity, then that's going to help you in many more aspects of the business for a longer period of time than anything else that you can do. And that's the simple analogy for why retention matters so much when you're seeking to grow ARR, just like we all are. So look, how do you reverse gravity? Retain your customers. That seems pretty simple, straightforward. We're going to dig into that a little bit more. But before I get into that, why should you listen to me, right? So Tony was very gracious and kind of walked through some of the brands that I've had an opportunity to work with over the course of a 20-year career in corporate America before becoming a startup founder and part of the Mucker family here. I've had an opportunity to work in financial services, travel, entertainment. These brands have nothing at all in common except the common thread is how do you identify your customers so that you can create a better experience for them so that they will come back again and again and your business will grow. And that's a common thread across all these businesses. And I would argue across all businesses. It's just in some cases, you're talking about B2C customers. In some cases, you're talking about B2B clients. I'll also point out that across my career background, some of these companies have been very focused from the get-go on, hey, we need a retention strategy. You know, this is how we're going to win. Other companies are very focused on acquisition strategy. And I think that diversity of experience has really kind of helped me have a full picture of what it takes to acquire and retain customers and therefore grow the business. Side note, Activision is weirdly in between. I was there at a time when the video game industry is making a transition from I sell a disc or a cartridge for $60 and that's all you get to all games now are live services with an ongoing monetization platform. Happy to lead a transition as part of that experience, but video games are still in a weird state. Pointing that out, just in case any of you are familiar with that industry. All right, so going a layer deeper, and I've signposted this a little bit in what I've already shared, is that the real unlock is to have knowledge of your customers, specifically knowledge of your best customers, and retain those customers. So it isn't just about retaining your customers, it is about knowing your customers and retaining the best of them. I promised the diagnostic. Here's a diagnostic. So this is a simple test that you should be able to do in an hour or less. So how far down this list can you go? So base level, we collect some customer level data. You know, we have an account creation process. There's some profile information that's collected there. We're collecting website clicks at a customer level. Okay, you know, we've got transaction data at a customer level. All right, you know, those are kind of table stakes for organizing your business around your customers. B starts to get a little bit into the knowledge piece of this. Okay, well, can I identify my number one customer? Do I even have a sense of what number one means in my company? You know, is it revenue? Is it profit? Is it something else, right? Can I quantify that? Now I'm at C. Now I'm going to D. Okay, well, have I had the conversation or done the mental math internally to say, well, I know what they bring to me. What am I willing to invest in order to keep them? Let's go further down. Do I know how to keep them, right? Maybe, you know, they give me $500 of revenue. I'm willing to spend 300, but do I know how to spend that 300 in order to kind of keep that customer? And then F, at the highest sign of maturity, hey, I've operationalized all those things so that I don't have to think about this and this isn't a manual decision. And these are actions that are happening. Therefore, my retention funnel is automatically happening on its own. If you want to continue going down this path of maturity, I gave an example in the previous slide of who's your number one customer. You can, of course, take that deeper, right? Hey, who's the top 1% of your customer base, the top 20% of your customer base? Do you know this for all of your customer base? You can go into KPI precision. We talked about revenue, but maybe you should be thinking about profit margin. Maybe you're making decisions on a quarterly basis about what your ARR or LTV is going to be over a 3-year basis or a longer basis than that. That's an even greater sense of maturity. If you're very early stage, you may not have the luxury to think that far ahead because you need to solve tomorrow's problems today. However, depending on your stage, that might be the right way to kind of start tuning your lens going forward so you can make better decisions now that will benefit you in the future. Same thing with time and multi-year. Regarding the maturity of the actions, many companies will have a retention campaign or a win-back campaign or do those things. How one-to-one are you able to make that, right? So I've had an opportunity to work in industries such as, movies or video games. Tony is a really highly skilled Call of Duty player. I don't know if that's true, but for this example, we'll infer that he is. Julius is a terrible Call of Duty player. That is true. I'm actually completely awful at Call of Duty in spite of playing 10 hours a week while I was working there. The types of things that you need to do to retain Tony are very different than the types of things you need to do to retain Julius, right? So if Tony is highly skilled, then he doesn't need things like aim assist, more health, those different types of things that I need because I'm bad, right? The scenario you want to avoid for a bad Call of Duty player is that they die 30 times in 10 minutes and they throw the controller against the wall and then never play again. That is a churn-inducing event, right? How can you soften the blow for that? You give a little bit of aim assist. You give a little bit of extra health. You do some small things around the margin that prevent the worst case scenario and take churn off the table for that. Those things don't help a good Call of Duty player like Tony. What Tony wants is he wants more challenges and more rewards for achieving those challenges. So early on, you give him a special bonus for a kill streak of 5, a kill streak of 10, right? You do these other things and you kind of accelerate his journey into the rewards pathway, which is what Tony is there for. That's an example of what I mean of a more one-to-one, or in the example that I gave, because we literally implemented that for Call of Duty, a segment or cohort-based retention strategy rather than a broad thing. Oh, all Call of Duty players need X in order to be retained. That is only seldom true. So what's the payoff for doing all this work? And depending on your perspective, this could sound like a lot of work, or it might not sound like a lot of work. But what I would posit is this, is that when you know your top 20% of your customers really well, then the 80-20 rule generally holds across most businesses and industries. So if you know your top 20% of your customer base and you know how to retain them, then you can effectively lock in 80% of your ARR or LTV on a year-over-year basis. And on top of that, you can help your acquisition strategy by starting from the positive outcome and working backwards from there of, okay, well, how do I go out and acquire more people that look like this top 20%, right? If I can choose between acquiring, random customer across my entire customer base or requiring a premium customer, everyone's going to want to acquire a premium customer. So now you have an opportunity to do that if you've got this deep knowledge of what that premium customer looks like in your business. And finally, look, especially as founders, time, focus, dollars, these are all finite things. There is some freedom in, again, air quote ignoring, but paying less attention to your bottom 80% of your customers. Look, this is about selectively overinvesting in what's going to get you the highest ROI. That is true for marketing spend. That's true for a lot of product decisions. What I'm sharing here today is that is absolutely true for your customer base and retention-based strategies in order to drive growth.
Hey, Julius, if you don't mind me interrupting with a question, and
Please.
For the record, I'm a terrible Call of Duty player. When I used to be younger in game a lot before I was married and kids, I was more of a Counter-Strike player. But yeah, thanks for making me sound like a much better gamer than I am. But my question is retention actions, and I know this is a very common question. Just not even talking about B2C applications, but also B2B as well. Do you have any tips on how to identify what are the right retention actions to focus on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The short answer that I will give, it is going to be something that sits at the intersection of what makes sense for your business, and what will be attractive to the customer. And that sounds like a really obvious statement to make, but I can give you examples of companies that are out there that don't actually follow that rule. So look, any customer is going to be excited if you give product away for free, right? And in many cases, that will win them back. In some cases, it won't. But that's a decision that absolutely makes no sense at all for your business. It's why one of the points in the diagnostic in the previous slide was talking about, well, how much are you willing to invest in order to retain that customer, right? That's not an infinite number. On the customer side, I think the answer is obviously going to vary by customer and by the industry, but the way in which I would encourage any attendee of this webinar or any founder to answer that question is, how well do you understand why that customer was engaged with you in the first place? And then how do you do something in order to kind of reactivate that? So I'll give you an example. I'll spoil an example that I was going to get into later in the webinar, which was at AMC theaters. We frequently talk about the habit of movie going, right? Going to the movies is kind of like going to the gym. Very few people walk out of the gym or movie theater and say, wow, I really wish I hadn't done that, right? Like, generally speaking, it's a really positive experience, except what happens? You go home and then you don't go back to the gym as frequently as you think that you should. You don't go back to the movies as frequently as you should. The top customers do have a habit of movie going, right? They will reliably come every week. They will go do other things or whatnot. And every now and again, you recognize when that habit starts to wobble, right? And so, again, if Tony has fantastic taste in movies because he is going to see all of the Oscar noms and, has different types of things, and my movie transaction list looks really weird because I've got Trolls 3 in there for my kids. Then I've also got, like, action flicks and whatever else. Man, I don't know what to do. The opportunity is, hey, do I recognize why Tony is coming to AMC? Do I recognize why Julius is coming to AMC? And how do I help remind them of that? Maybe I buy popcorn a lot and I haven't bought popcorn in a while. You give me a free popcorn coupon and that will help remind me of that and restart that habit again. And so, while that's not a direct answer to your question, Tony, I hope that illuminates a little bit of the process that I would encourage business owners and especially founders to go through. That's a really good example of the type of knowledge that we talk about when we talk about knowing your customer.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. So we've gone through the diagnostic. We're getting into the actions. Tony done a great job of kind of previewing, the types of things that, we're going to get into in a little bit. And I recognize that we've got a lot of attendees that might be at different stages of their maturity for their company. So what I've tried to do here is I've tried to tranche out things that you can do if you're early stage, things that you can do if you're a very mature company and are at revenue and are looking to scale, at a really high level, and some things that you can do in between. And at the highest level, to walk through the structure, when you're early, man, just start with data, start your learning, build your knowledge, and do those things. When you're in between, okay, how do I take knowledge and how do I institutionalize this? And typically, this will be through performance metrics, this will be through goals, this will be through those different types of things, because we manage to what we measure, and every employee in the company is going to understand goals. It's what we use as an aligning mechanism. And so that's how you institutionalize, hey, we're going to have a customer focus. We're going to use this data. This is going to help us win. And then at maturity, this is really about operationalizing. This is about how do you integrate this to make sure that your insights and actions become customer facing and then have a real revenue impact, ARR impact at scale over time. So let me share a story from each of these stages in order to kind of help illustrate a little bit for the audience. I hope there's something useful here that they can take away. So understanding your best customers. Marriott and Expedia are both travel companies, but they're very different types of companies, right? Marriott is a global hotel chain that really competes with frequent business travelers and large group bookings. It's very common to have a top customer at Marriott spend more than 300 nights a year in the hotel. Great for Marriott's business, probably terrible for that person personally. We try not to think too much about that. Expedia is a very different type of business. If you are a frequent business traveler, you are not using Expedia. because you already have a favorite hotel, you have a favorite airline, you're some status in their programs. You don't need to go search on price. Expedia's customer base tends to be people that only travel once a year or twice a year at most. There's not a lot of repeat business. So the 80-20 rule absolutely holds for Marriott, where 20% of the customer base is contributing 80% or more of Marriott's net margin on an annual basis. For Expedia, it is much more of a 60-80 rule. The repeat purchase frequency is so low that it completely changes the dynamic. So when you understand that, then it really makes sense that Marriott is investing billions of dollars into its Merit Rewards program as a retention mechanism, and that Expedia is spending nearly $1 billion a year on paid search in order to focus on its acquisition engine. And so that level of insight can really help to guide decisions of what you're doing as a company. That doesn't mean that Expedia doesn't have a loyalty program. They do, but it serves a very different purpose in the overall corporate strategy versus Marriott. Example of customer level insights. When you start from the end and look at people that have been with Marriott for 20 years or more, you say, hey, what are some commonalities, that are here? And you find out that for the most part, it is customers that have had transaction diversity with Marriott, which in Marriott's case means I've stayed at multiple brands, I've stayed during the week and on weekends, I've done short transient stays, and I've also done long extended stays. And if you think about it intuitively, that makes a ton of sense. That, hey, there's a difference between someone that's chosen Marriott as their overall hospitality provider versus someone that just likes one hotel, right? Or someone that just likes Courtyard or something like that. There's a completely different level of engagement and then therefore built-in organic retention that happens with the transaction diverse customer versus the non-transaction diverse customer. When digging into the data science, we basically determined that after someone made 3 stays with Marriott, we could determine with about 80% accuracy what level they were going to hit in the next 12 months and what their future value was going to be. So starting from the end of what does it take to make a really valuable customer, then we got into, okay, well, how fast can I detect that? The answer is 3 stays. That's 3 independent decisions that someone has made to raise their hand or not raise their hand about I'm going to be a diverse customer versus not a diverse customer. For Activision, that number is 3 hours. At Activision, we talked a lot about the first 3 minutes, the first 30 minutes, the first 3 hours, and then the first 30 hours. 3 hours, if you got to play 3 hours of Call of Duty, your retention rate was extremely high. It's very variable before that. And if any of you are in the mobile game space or know the mobile game space, you know that it's even more brutal there, where the average time in order for someone to download an app and then keep it is like 15 minutes or less, because there are so many people that download and then delete immediately. So early experience matters in Activision, and that helped to guide a lot of our strategies. I'm skipping ahead a little bit to a story that I'll tell in Mature. But the point is that when you start from the end of what you want to achieve and you work backwards from there, you can get some really interesting insights about what to do and also when is the important time in order to do that. And all you need is a little bit data, but a lot of focus in order to kind of get to those, regardless of your stage. For middle stage companies, I would encourage, again, kind of integration into your measurement, and your frameworks. Think about things like, okay, rather than a marketing performance goal of, we want to grow retention, by 5% versus last year. If you buy, the focus of 80-20, then talk about building a cohort for that top 20% and focus on building metrics against that. You're going to have a lot more success, higher quality data, and it's going to drive a stronger business outcome for you overall with a higher ROI, faster, more efficiently in order to go and do that. And then finally, if you're a mature company, this is just about execution and scale. It is one-to-one. I do encourage to learn how to retain one customer because customers are individuals, and then think about how to scale that rather than saying, hey, how am I going to scale, retain customers in general? And then how do I tune maybe a little bit of personalization in there? Because you're going to get to two very different places depending on where you start. So one example for AMC, because I've already used the Call of Duty example is one-to-one promotions. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to the Call of Duty example because that's a little more fun. So when we learned about the 3 hours, sorry, the 3 minutes, the 30 minutes, and the 3 hours, then the insight there was that we had to detect how good of a Call of Duty player you were within the first minute of you playing. And that sounds a little bit difficult, but it was actually ended up being really easy to do. Because in addition to obvious things like, okay, are you aiming well? Are you hitting headshots? Are you running, against the walls? Or are you just kind of blindly running out into the open? There were things like, well, hey, before you even loaded the game, did you go monkey with your loadout? Or did you just go straight into quick play, right? Did you go explore, customize, and do different types of things? And all of those ended up being early detection mechanisms for us to put you very quickly into a high skill player cohort versus a low skill player cohort. Of course, there were some times that we were wrong with early detection, and we had mechanisms to flip you between those two. But in a scenario where you have an anonymous, non-repeat new customer coming in, where you don't know anything about them, then detection quick was the key to making sure that you could actually affect the first 3-minute experience of that player playing the game. We did those things, and we saw that we were able to kind of reduce churn among new players by 20%, which had very meaningful impacts to downstream revenue and ARR. So what I've done for the next 2 slides is I've gone a little deeper into Marriott and AMC theaters, and I've tried to pick low complexity and high complexity tactics that may help resonate depending on what stage that you're at. Marriott International, I think one simple thing that they did here that I would pick out was that they named what a good customer was, which made it very obvious in conversations internally and for staff or service delivery about, oh, well, this is a valuable customer, you should treat them well, right? It's one thing for a top 20% to exist in a spreadsheet or a database somewhere, but if nobody knows about that, then you can't act upon that. So intuitively, it's very obvious that all Marriott customers are valuable, of course, because we're a hospitality company, but a member is more valuable than a non-member because they've taken the time to sign up for the program and they have some intent to return. And a platinum member, is more valuable than a gold, a silver, or a basic member within that program. And that simple shortcut really helped to accelerate a lot of decision making that was important in order to selectively overinvest in your best customers. Another thing that I will cherry pick from a mature tactic that Marriott International did. Of course, they've got the rewards program. What may not be obvious is that the number one feature of why the Marriott program drives retention is not free room nights. That's actually number 5 on the list. The number one reason is recognition. You know who I am when I show up at the hotel, and you treat me better because of who I am. For a traveler, that makes sense, right? It's an away game. I'm away from home. I'm seeking comfort. I'm seeking familiarity here, right? I'm sharing some insights into the why the customer's with you in the first place, right? And that's important. The good news is that it costs the company very little to recognize Tony, when he shows up. Welcome back, to the San Antonio Marriott. Hey, thank you for staying with us for 100 nights this year. We've recorded your room preferences. You like high floors, away from the elevator. In fact, we've taken an opportunity to, upgrade your room this time, which you'll go down the list of who will benefit this the most as you go down the customers. And hotels have gotten to the point where they'll personalize a welcome gift depending on the guest preferences as well. These are things that I would say are engagement and retention mechanisms with asymmetric value, because it costs Marriott very little to do these things, and the guest values it a lot. So when you can find opportunities to do that, there are many things you can use in the toolbox in order to grow and retain your customers if you know them. All right, I'm going to move on because I recognize where we are on time. But I'm happy to talk about any of these other things offline if anyone finds them particularly interesting and reaches out afterwards. AMC theaters, simple tactic. Well, before I joined AMC, they did have a loyalty program. It's called AMC Stubs. It's something you paid $15 a year for. And when you did not renew your membership or you hadn't come to AMC in 12 months, they purged your data. And so the simple insight that I would give here is that, look, just find ways to make sure your data, customer data, is growing by default. There's no reason for AMC to throw away those data. Many people will go longer than a year before visiting a theater, but then they'll come back and they might create a new habit. And another thing that I did soon after arriving at AMC, recognizing the relative lack of maturity around customer data and customer knowledge within the company, was just to start publishing content internally within the company. Just start broadcasting KPIs in order to call our shot on, this is what's going to be important, this is how we're going to win, and just keep watching this because you're going to see these numbers go up, right? And what we did is we primed internal organizations about what the future of success was going to look like, because we knew we needed those internal organizations in order to achieve the growth goals that we had. Again, this is a large corporation, maybe less relevant in a startup, but the marketing department needs IT, they need finance, they need legal to be on board with all these things that we're going to be doing, operations. In a startup, look, if you're 3 people, maybe this is already happening, but communication can help. One of the things that we did at AMC in order to really make sure that customers wanted to self-identify and participate in giving their data was to give them a product experience reason why. Before my arrival, 70% of tickets were purchased with cash, day of, walk up at the box office. Those are all anonymous transactions you know nothing about, you have no advance warning. There's very little data to be collected there. By the time that I left AMC, 60% of transactions were online tickets booked at least 3 days in advance, which has all kinds of advantages. Number one, you're locking in the demand, right? You are creating the shortest amount of time between I want to go to the theaters and I'm buying the ticket, because life gets in the way. But you're also giving an opportunity for the rest of the company to kind of plan accordingly. Okay, we get to forecast demand a little bit, days in advance. Therefore, we can staff the theater more appropriately. We can make sure that the right movie is playing in the right auditorium with the right number of seats and shift accordingly in advance versus being caught off guard. More relevant to this conversation that we're having today is we created motivations for customers to self-identify and engage with us digitally, which then grew our data consistently over time, right? And it wasn't because we rewarded them, with money or promotions or discounts or all these different types of things. We gave them a better experience. You can pick your seat in advance. You can know you got a ticket, right? You have that assurance of experience versus a wider cone of uncertainty of showing up to the auditorium day of, and I have no idea what's going to happen. So hopefully some of these examples are relevant or can resonate or can be helpful, depending on what your particular company is working on. All right. So if I can summarize, 1, churn is gravity. If you can reverse gravity, that's magic. 2, if you want to grow ARR, I really encourage everybody to build your customer knowledge and use that to retain your best customers. It's okay to air quote ignore your bottom 80% of your customers if that means that you're going to serve your top 20% of your customers really well, because it's going to have the biggest impact on your business. And candidly, look, if you're building a better product experience for your top 20% of customers, that's probably going to be pretty relevant to the rest of your customer base as well. How do you get started? Start by collecting data. Start building your insights. I would say focus especially on transactional data. You can have lots of profile demographic data about, this person being in a certain age group with an income or their ethnicity or whatever else. What someone does is so much more important than who they are or what they say they're going to do. So one piece of transactional data will blow away many pieces of demographic or profile data. So the more you can focus on transactions, that's the bottom of the funnel equivalent to KPI and business performance. I encourage you to focus on that. Once you start getting that data, make sure it's integrated into your workflow. Communicate it, put it into your goals, make sure you're measuring against it. And then finally, this is about operationalizing and scale in order to make sure that you've got this engine that continues to grow this rather than it just being a strategy in a meeting room somewhere. You've heard me use the phrase start from the end and work backwards a couple of times over the course of the webinar, but I truly believe in that as a focusing agent, right? It's something that we do as founders a lot too, right? We talk about product market fit. What is it that's actually gonna latch? Cool, we find something. Okay, well, how do we scale that, right? Versus the universe of things that we could do or we thought we were going to do in the beginning. And so this is not a new philosophy. I'm just encouraging us to apply this philosophy to customers and for retention strategies specifically. All right. And if me talking for 40 minutes wasn't enough and you want to learn more, then number one, please reach out. I am happy to chat. I'm happy to give a pat on the back. I'm happy to give a kick in the pants, a sanity check, whatever else that you need. If I can be of service and give a couple of hours that saves you a couple of weeks or a couple of months, that is my genuine pleasure. So if any of this is interesting to you, then I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'm also, if you actually go through and do the diagnostic, I would love to hear from you about what you learned, what that process was like, whether it was really helpful or whether I was full of crap. My teenage daughters would be very unsurprised with the latter result. So I have been in the industry for a really long time. So many of the books that influenced me are much older. I encourage you to go out there, and there's lots of really good content that is out there on this topic. Pick things among the threads that you heard today that resonate the most. But if you're interested in reading older books, these are three examples of different types of books that have been very influential to me over the course of my career. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I can share that later as well. Thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate the opportunity to share today.
Awesome. That was amazing, Julius. So yeah, for those of you, I don't think we've had really anyone drop off. Smaller group today, but I haven't seen anyone leave. So that's great. Like, as I was sitting here listening to you, it's like, this is amazing. And there's a lot of things that, personally I've learned myself. If I could jump in with a few questions from some of your earlier slides, and I wanted to frame this in the context of, the core audience that we are serving, which are Mucker portfolio companies and founders, right? Founders of early stage startups. Completely appreciate the examples that you shared through these large brands, but for small companies, there's not a lot of resources, very little time, as we all know. So in terms of, just starting off, like you had that one slide of early stage and mid stage and mature stage. And I guess this is kind of tied to my earlier question, but maybe we could double click on it a little bit more. Where do we start? I think that's a very common question across the board from founders, regardless of, whether or not we're talking B2B versus B2C, retention versus, acquisition, or even the stages in between, activation and things like that. A lot of times we just don't know where to start, right? And so what would you say to a fellow founder, who just got started? They have a small team and it's founder-led, everything, founder-led customer success, founder-led support, founder-led product management. What would you say that are, one, two, or three actionable things that they could do tomorrow if they're at the early stage?
Yeah, no, Tony, that's a great question. Of course, I have empathy for a resource constrained environment, especially after the whiplash in context of coming from the corporate world, where you've got too many people and too many resources. Well, never too many resources, never have too many resources, but an abundance versus a dearth. I would encourage, number one, to start with data, right? And that's why that's the number one on the list, and trying to get that way you're making fact-based decisions, right? Rather than intuition or opinion-based ones. I would always encourage everyone, but especially founders, if you have a big problem, how do you break it down into a smaller one, right? And in this case, it is, don't try to solve retention across your entire customer base, right? Solve it for your top cohort, or even start by finding your number one customer and solving it for that customer. I hope the examples of Tony being a great Call of Duty player and my being a terrible Call of Duty player resonate, right? Tony having outstanding movie preferences and mine being a hot mess because of my kids. That those simply serve to illustrate that retention is a one-to-one game. It is not a mass game. right? Customers don't view your business in that way. Yes, you are serving hundreds, thousands, millions of customers. But from the customer lens, if you put yourself in their shoes, it is a one-to-one relationship in their eyes. And that's how you need to meet them in order to retain them. Because the why, right? We talked about the customer why. That's different, for Tony versus Julius, depending on the brand that you're talking about. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question, Tony. I mean, that's what I would encourage to start. Obviously, it's harder to get more specific without talking about the company in general, but I'm trying to outline an approach that can take something that feels like a really big rock and turns it into smaller ones.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And then kind of in the same vein, another challenge, let's just say, for early stage startups is maybe they don't have enough data to make some of these informed decisions, right? Maybe, when we say top 1% or top customer, especially for the B2B. And I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this session, this is focused on B2C, but there's applications across the board in terms of these concepts for B2B and B2C, right? But especially for some of our B2B founders, like selling to enterprise even, they don't have hundreds or thousands of customers or users. They have 10 or 5, maybe 2 customers. Now, I know part of it is starting to get into the whole acquisition side of the house, but how do you start to think about gathering enough data where it's statistically relevant, right? Versus, on the other end, I'm just going to optimize for one customer. And especially for B2B, I hear this a lot. They end up risking becoming their, in-house development or outsourced development firm, right? So how do you start thinking about, at the earlier stages when you don't have a lot of data to go off of?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. Number one, in some cases, constraints can be beautiful. If you have one customer, then it's really important to retain that customer, and that provides you some focus. To your point about going to native on that, some factor of that has to be, okay, well, what are the types of customers that you want, right? And maybe, hopefully, there's a perfect overlap in the Venn diagram between those two. Right? This goes back to the framework of what does the customer want and what do you want as a company, right? Of course, the customer that you have, they want you to do everything that you can in order to retain them and keep them happy. There may not be perfect overlap between those two. And so you should allow yourself some space to go after a different type of customer in that regard, and then ultimately have a chance to retain them. I would say, we founders are also very comfortable dealing with hypotheses, right? There's a lot of what we do that is a hypothesis. So if you don't have data, man, just form hypotheses and go and test them. Here again, these are things that founders are used to doing in other contexts, but we don't always think to do that in the context of what we're talking about today. And so, that's a lot of kind of what I'm encouraging.
Got it. Okay. And then kind of shifting along that spectrum. So another question is, let's just say assume that we have a good amount of data. We're starting to notice these customer insights or user insights, right? And we start to notice that there are different segments, if you will, of what we would consider top customers. How do you then figure out which ones to focus on? You know what I mean? So, and let's just take the Marriott example with frequent travelers for businesses, and then maybe slightly less frequent travelers, but for personal. And perhaps their behaviors and preferences are going to be different. So how do you then figure out which ones to optimize for and focus on?
Yeah.
Good example or not, but.
Well, I think I'll answer most of your question, and then I'll answer a slightly different one, right? So most of the questions that you're asking, I would say I would encourage this is why I encourage companies to start from what is the overall KPI that you're trying to optimize? Is it revenue? Is it net margin? Is it LTV? Like, are you looking at that and then work backwards from there? Because the math is the math, right? It is a factual answer who your top customer is, who your top 10% is, or whatever else. Now, how they got there or why is going to vary. That's the interesting part of it, right? So in your example, Tony, we were talking about frequent business travelers and leisure travelers as binary things. but mostly they're not, right? So I'm someone that travels for business a lot, but then I earn all these points and I feel guilty, and I want to take my family on awesome vacations so that, they will continue to love me and excuse, all the time that I spend away, right? I gave the example as I was talking through Marriott about the difference between, hotel loyalty, brand loyalty, and Marriott loyalty, right? And that the more diverse you are in your activity, the closer you are to being loyal to Marriott versus this is a hotel that's near my grandma and I go there when I visit her for Thanksgiving, right? That's a very different why for why a customer has transacted. And so I think understanding that is important. It is an interesting thing to detect what state a customer is in, whether I'm in my frequent business traveler mode or my leisure mode. And sometimes you can figure that out by the property, but other times you have to figure that out by how the customer is engaging with you. I gave the example of how we try to detect that in Call of Duty. I would say Netflix is a company that does this really well, where you're motivated to pick the profile that you are and self-identify when you sign into Netflix, because I don't want all the weird teenage drama stuff that my kids watch on my recommendation list. I want my own list to be my own list, right? And that helps to kind of clean up what data that would otherwise be mushy. AMC theaters never got to that point, right? When I was describing that my transaction history with AMC is a mess, because sometimes I'm reserving a movie for myself, sometimes I'm reserving a movie for a date night with my wife, sometimes I'm booking tickets for the whole family to go out. If you're not able to distinguish between those things, then it can be a little bit messy, but it's still Julius, right? I'm still the decision maker. So start with the value, work backwards, but then understand that the why and then therefore what to do about it is a human being personal decision in that regard. And that's where some of the most valuable insights can come from.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience. And the question is, when you were at Marriott and AMC and you were examining your loyalty programs, were there other outside programs that you were looking to for inspiration, best practices to learn from those outside of the companies you were in?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. I think, companies that really only look internally for inspiration are just doomed to fail at some point, and certainly not going to be a source of innovation. Sometimes that external analogy can be very close. Airline programs are really interesting. It's an example of where customers love the loyalty program, but they hate the core product. And the reason why they love the loyalty program, people are very proud of being a Delta Sky Miles member, because it gets them all kinds of stuff that might insulate them for what might otherwise be a very uncomfortable core cattle class experience, right? Video games were big sources of inspiration for us as well, mainly because they activated these principles without mechanisms of like points and free room nights and all those really transactional types of things. They basically would give you milestones and reward you for that. They would, basically create motivation through leaderboards, and they created a sense of progression and, importantly, community-based progression in some of the games that really had relevance to merit rewards in the hospitality industry overall. A lot of these frequent business travelers, they know each other, they see each other, they kind of like show off. I don't know if everyone remembers the movie Up in the Air, the scene when George Clooney and his co-star are out there comparing all the cards they have for all the different types of things. I mean, that is a real thing, right? And so, to understand and kind of activate that social dynamic in a completely different context, like a video game, provides inspiration for how you can do that without literally shelling out dollars to a customer in order to achieve that.
Great, thank you. And then we'll close with one last question. This is a question specifically from one of our audience members that's in the B2B space. And so the question, I'll summarize the paragraph. So in a B2B SaaS company, there are a cross-functional set of users of their product, but then there's also the concept of the economic buyer, the decision maker who makes the decision to buy their SaaS product. And so can you apply this practice of identifying customer level insights for both the users as well as the decision makers who may not necessarily be active users of the product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the short answer is yes. This is absolutely a exercise that is worth doing, especially because the environment may be complex and it may be multi-party. I would posit it is always important to focus on the decision maker, right? And so, at Marriott, this could be an individual person that was booking for themselves. It could be a meeting organizer that was booking a block of several hundred rooms on behalf of a larger corporation. And somewhere in between, it is the consulting lead of a small team that they're a Marriott guy or they're a Hilton guy. So everyone on the team stays at Hilton when they travel. Because guess what? That's the person that makes the room reservations. So I think, getting to the heart of who's making the decision, but then understanding that only an outstanding experience delivered for everybody will allow that decision maker to keep making the decision that they want is an important thing. But here again, time, focus, resources are limited. Anytime that you can focus and get a better outcome, that's a powerful thing. So I would absolutely encourage that exercise for the person that asked that question.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up. And if we don't mind jumping to the final slide for next steps, as Julius mentioned, in being so gracious to offer up his help as a fellow Mucker founder, you can see his contact information there, Julius at artshare.io. So if any of you who are still listening to this call, or even afterwards that are listening to the recording, would like to pick his brain and trade notes, feel free to reach out to him or to me. I can make an intro as well. And this is actually one of the things that we're trying to do more of at Mucker, which is getting our Mucker founders to learn and share with each other. So definitely take Julius up on that very generous offer. And then likewise, if you are interested in a particular topic or would like to share about something that you've learned that you feel can benefit to the greater community, definitely reach out to Britton at muckercapital.com to schedule future sessions. Thank you for everyone who joined us today.